The cold rain lashed against the pavement like 1,000 stinging needles, while the figure huddled on the sidewalk looked like little more than a pile of discarded rags. I saw the reflections of the city lights dancing in the oil-slicked puddles, but those neon glows felt like they belonged to a world I no longer inhabited, even though I owned half the buildings on this very street. Just 3 hours ago, I was Marcus Thorne, the youngest billionaire CEO in the tech industry, whose name could move markets with a single tweet. But now, I was just another invisible ghost shivering in the shadows of a luxury high-rise. Just before we get back to it, I'm curious to know, where are you watching from today? And if these stories have been keeping you captivated, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. My designer suits and multi-million-dollar deals were replaced by a crusty, oversized jacket and a pair of boots that had holes in the soles, letting the freezing water soak into my socks. I watched hundreds of people pass me by with their umbrellas tilted away to avoid eye contact, as if poverty were a contagious disease they might catch if they looked too closely. Then she appeared through the gray mist of the downpour like a quiet miracle, wearing a simple yellow raincoat and holding a steaming paper cup that smelled of rich cocoa and cinnamon. She didn't just toss a coin at me or walk past with a look of pity, but instead she knelt right there in the mud, and the grime letting her own expensive-looking bag get soaked just to be at eye level with me. As she handed me the warm cup, her eyes caught mine with a piercing intensity that made my heart stop, because for a fleeting second I thought she recognized the man behind the mask. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box which seemed completely out of place for a girl who looked like she worked a regular 9-to-5 job at the local library. She didn't say a word at first, but she took my shaking hand in hers and pressed the box into my palm before leaning in to whisper something that turned my entire world upside down. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized that this undercover mission, meant to test the humanity of my city, had just uncovered a secret I was never supposed to find. Just as I opened my mouth to ask her how she knew, she stood up and vanished into the crowd, leaving me holding a diamond ring that I recognized as the exact same one my mother had lost 20 years ago. The shock hit me harder than the cold, and I scrambled to my feet with my heart hammering against my ribs, because the girl in the yellow raincoat wasn't just a random stranger. I tried to shout after her, but my voice was lost in a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the street, and when the lightning flashed, I saw a black car pulling up to the curb with tinted windows that I knew all too well. This wasn't just a test of character anymore, because it had become a hunt for a ghost I thought was buried long ago. And now, I had to choose between my billion-dollar empire and the truth behind that velvet box. The black sedan sat idling by the curb like a predatory beast waiting for its moment to strike, while I stood there clutching the velvet box so tightly that the corners dug into my palm. I knew that vehicle because it was part of the very fleet I paid for, yet seeing it here in this torrential downpour made me feel like a hunted man rather than a powerful executive. The windows were opaque and cold, reflecting the flickering neon of the city in a way that felt distorted and sinister, as if the world I built was turning its back on me. My heart was still racing from the encounter with the girl in the yellow raincoat, who had vanished into the mist like a phantom, leaving me with a relic of a past I had tried to forget. I looked down at the ring inside the box, and the small diamond caught a stray beam of light from a street lamp, sending a spark of brilliance through the gloom that felt like a direct signal from my childhood. 20 years ago, my mother had disappeared from a street just like this one, leaving behind nothing but a shattered life and the mystery of this very piece of jewelry. I had spent millions on private investigators and high-tech surveillance throughout my career, but I had never found a single lead until a stranger handed it to me in the middle of a storm. The car door began to creep open with a slow and deliberate movement that suggested whoever was inside was in no rush to reveal themselves to the shivering beggar on the sidewalk. I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of the cold from my brain as I realized I couldn't let them see my face, because if they were looking for Marcus Thorne, they wouldn't expect him to be huddled in the mud. I pulled the hood of my tattered jacket lower over my brow and slumped my shoulders to mimic the weight of 1,000 lost dreams, while my mind raced through every possible scenario. The person who stepped out of the car wasn't a bodyguard or a corporate rival, but a man in a sharp gray suit holding an umbrella with a precision that spoke of military training. He didn't look at me directly, but he scanned the area where the girl had just been standing as if he were tracking a scent that had gone cold in the rain. I held my breath as he stepped closer, his polished shoes splashing into the puddle right next to my hand, and I could smell the expensive cologne that usually filled my own boardroom. He pulled out a phone and made a quick call saying only that the package had been delivered, but the target was still unaware of the full scope of the arrangement. My blood ran cold at those words, because it meant my undercover experiment wasn't as secret as I had believed, and someone was playing a much deeper game with my life. He turned his head slightly, and for a split second our eyes met through the shadows of my hood, and I saw a flash of recognition that made him reach for something inside his jacket pocket. I didn't wait to see what it was, but instead I rolled backward and scrambled into the dark alleyway behind me, ignoring the pain in my knees as I hit the wet bricks. I ran deeper into the labyrinth of the city's backstreets, where the trash bins and shadows offered a temporary sanctuary from the man in the gray suit and his mysterious mission. I needed to find that girl again, because she was the only link between the billionaire I was and the boy who lost everything 2 decades ago. As I reached the end of the alley, I saw a flickering light coming from a basement window, and a familiar yellow sleeve caught my eye just before it disappeared behind a heavy iron door. I knew I was walking into a trap, but the weight of the ring in my hand was heavier than any fear I had of what lay behind that rusted metal entrance. The iron door groaned on its hinges with a sound like a dying animal as I pushed it open and stepped into the dimly lit basement that smelled of old parchment and damp earth. I felt the weight of the rain-soaked jacket pulling at my shoulders, but my focus was entirely on the flicker of candlelight at the far end of the long corridor. My boots made a squelching sound with every step, which echoed against the low ceiling and made me feel exposed in a way that no board meeting ever could. I kept my hand wrapped around the velvet box in my pocket, as if it were a talisman that could protect me from the shadows lurking in the corners of this underground bunker. The girl in the yellow raincoat was standing by a wooden table covered in weathered maps and photographs that looked like they had been salvaged from a fire. She had taken off her hood to reveal a crown of tight curls that caught the golden light of the candles, and she didn't look surprised to see me at all. She looked at me with a calm expression that made me feel like the one who was out of place, even though I was the one with the billions in the bank. She spoke with a voice that was soft, yet carried the authority of someone who had spent her entire life studying the secrets of the city. She told me that she had been waiting for the day Marcus Thorne would finally step out of his ivory tower and look at the world from the gutter where the truth actually lives. I felt a surge of anger at her cryptic words, because I had spent my life building a legacy to escape the very gutter she was talking about, but she just pointed at the ring in my hand. She explained that the jewelry wasn't just a piece of gold and stone, but a key to a vault that my father had hidden before he was betrayed by his own business partners. My heart hammered against my ribs as she pulled a photograph from the pile and slid it across the table toward me, showing a young version of myself, standing next to a man I barely remembered. Behind us in the photo was the very same black car that had been trailing me on the street, and I realized that the enemies of my past were still the masters of my present. She said her name was Ilara, and that her family had been the silent guardians of my mother's legacy for 2 decades while I was busy chasing stock prices and market dominance. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, because I had always thought I was an orphan of circumstance, but now it seemed I was an orphan of a calculated conspiracy. Ilara stepped closer, and the candlelight reflected in her dark eyes as she told me that the man in the gray suit was already inside my company and was preparing to dismantle everything I had built by the next morning. I looked at the maps on the table and saw that they weren't just city layouts but blueprints of my own corporate headquarters with red circles around the executive floor. I realized then that my undercover experiment had accidentally led me into the middle of a corporate coup that was being fueled by a blood feud from 20 years ago. The silence of the basement was suddenly shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs above us and the metallic click of a weapon being readied for use. Alara didn't panic, but instead she reached under the table and pulled out a heavy iron lever that opened a hidden passage behind a bookshelf. She told me that if I wanted to save my empire and find out what happened to my mother, I had to leave the billionaire behind and become the ghost the city thought I was. As the iron door at the top of the stairs burst open, I followed her into the darkness of the passage just as a hail of bullets splintered the wooden table where the maps had been lying. We were running through the veins of the city now, and I knew that by the time the sun rose, I would either be the most powerful man in the world or a memory buried under the pavement. The hidden passage was a narrow, damp artery of brick and mortar that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the city above us, while our footsteps echoed like frantic heartbeats against the cold stone. Alara moved with a fluid grace that suggested she had navigated these tunnels 1,000 times before while I stumbled in my oversized boots, feeling the weight of my simulated poverty crashing down on me. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust and the metallic tang of old pipes, but I didn't care because the adrenaline was the only thing keeping the chill from my bones. I looked back and saw the flicker of flashlights dancing against the walls behind us, which meant the men in the gray suits were not far off, and they weren't planning on taking prisoners. Alara reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me into a side alcove just as a beam of light swept past the opening, missing us by a fraction of an inch. We stood there in the absolute darkness, chest to chest, and I could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing, which remained remarkably calm despite the life-or-death stakes. She leaned in close and whispered that the tunnels were part of an old smuggling route that my grandfather had built long before the Thorne family became a household name. I was stunned because I had grown up believing my family history began with a small tech startup in a garage, but now it seemed the foundations of my wealth were built on much darker secrets. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and clicked it on just enough to illuminate a heavy bronze dial set into the wall that looked like the face of a giant clock. She told me that the ring I was holding wasn't just a memento but a physical key that worked in tandem with these ancient mechanisms to open the way into the true heart of the city. I looked at the ring and saw that the setting wasn't a standard claw mount, but a series of interlocking gears that were so fine they were almost invisible to the naked eye. I pressed the diamond into the center of the dial, and I felt a vibration beneath my feet, as if the very earth were shifting its weight to accommodate us. A segment of the wall slid back with a low grinding sound, revealing a chamber filled with filing cabinets and old servers that hummed with a low electric drone. This was the silent brain of the city, a hidden data center that had been recording every transaction and every conversation within the Thorne Empire for 20 years. Alara walked over to a terminal and began typing with a speed that rivaled my best software engineers, while she explained that my father had created this place as a fail-safe. He knew that the people he worked with were vultures, and he had documented every bribe, every threat, and every illegal deal they had ever made. She looked at the screen, and her face went pale as a new file popped up with a timestamp from only 5 minutes ago, labeled with my own name. It was an obituary pre-written and ready to be sent to every major news outlet in the country, stating that Marcus Thorne had died in a tragic accident involving a homeless encampment fire. The realization that my own board of directors had already signed my death warrant made the room spin, and I had to lean against a cold metal cabinet to keep from falling. Alara turned to me with a grim expression and said that we didn't just need to survive anymore, but we had to strike back before the sun hit the horizon. She pointed to a red light blinking on the console, which indicated that someone was currently trying to bypass the encryption from an external location inside my own penthouse. I knew that the only way to stop the upload was to get back to the surface and confront the man who was sitting in my chair, wearing my clothes and stealing my life. Just as I reached for the terminal to initiate a counterhack, the entire room shuddered, and the sound of an explosion rocked the tunnel system above us. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the monitors flickered wildly as a voice boomed over the internal intercom system that I recognized as my second-in-command. He wasn't looking for me to negotiate, but he was calling out to tell me that he had Alara's younger brother held captive at the entrance of the building. My heart sank as I realized the stakes had just shifted from corporate warfare to a rescue mission that I was completely unprepared to lead in my current state. The sound of my business partner's voice echoing through the damp chamber felt like a physical slap across my face, because it was a voice I had trusted for over a decade. Arthur Vance had been my mentor and my right hand since I was 22 years old, and seeing his name on the screen as the architect of my destruction felt like a betrayal of the highest order. Alara gripped the edge of the metal table until her knuckles turned white, while the flickering monitors cast long and jagged shadows against the ancient brickwork of the hidden vault. She looked at me with a mixture of desperation and a cold fury that told me her younger brother was the only thing in this world that mattered more than the secrets we were protecting. I realized in that moment that being a billionaire meant nothing if I couldn't protect a single innocent life, and my designer legacy felt like a hollow shell compared to the raw human connection in this room. Arthur's voice came over the intercom again with a smooth and chilling confidence that suggested he already considered himself the victor in this shadow war. He told us that we had exactly 1 hour to surrender the ring and the decryption keys before he finished what he started 20 years ago on that rain-slicked street. The mention of my mother's disappearance confirmed my worst fears, because it meant the man I had shared countless board meetings with was the same man who had torn my family apart. I felt a cold resolve settle over me that was far more powerful than the fear I had felt huddled in the rain, as Marcus Thorne, the CEO, was finally merging with the boy who had survived the streets. Alara reached into a hidden compartment beneath the servers and pulled out a tactical tablet that was linked to the city's private security cameras, which I had personally funded. She began swiping through the feeds with a blurred speed until she found a grainy image of a small boy being led into the freight elevator of the Thorne Plaza. My heart hammered against my ribs as I saw the terror on the child's face, and I knew that every second we spent debating our next move was a second he didn't have. I looked at my tattered clothes and my dirt-stained hands, and I realized that my current appearance was actually my greatest tactical advantage. Arthur expected a billionaire to come crawling back with a team of lawyers and bodyguards, but he didn't expect a ghost to rise from the sewers. I told Alara that we weren't going to surrender, but we were going to use the very tunnels my grandfather built to infiltrate the tower from the bottom up. She nodded slowly as she handed me a small earpiece that was encrypted against the corporate signals, and she told me that the passage ahead led directly into the maintenance basement of the headquarters. We began to move through the darkness once more, but this time my footsteps were silent, and my mind was as sharp as a razor because the hunt had officially begun. The tunnel narrowed until we were crawling through a ventilation shaft that hummed with the vibration of the massive cooling fans that kept my servers from overheating. I could smell the ozone and the expensive filtered air of the upper world as we reached a heavy iron grate that looked down into the executive garage. I saw Arthur standing by the elevator bank surrounded by the men in gray suits, and he was looking at his gold watch with a smirk that made my blood boil. He was so distracted by his own perceived brilliance that he didn't notice the shadow moving through the rafters above his head, or the way the lights flickered for a fraction of a second. Alara whispered into my ear that she was in position to override the elevator locks, but she needed me to create a distraction that would draw the guards away from the main doors. I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of the diamond ring one last time before I prepared to drop into the lion's den with nothing but my wits and the truth. Just as I was about to kick out the grate, A black van roared into the garage and skidded to a halt right in front of Arthur, blocking my line of sight. The side door slid open, and a woman stepped out who made my heart stop because she looked exactly like the portrait of my mother that hung in my private study. She wasn't a ghost or a memory, but a living, breathing person who was walking straight toward the man who had destroyed our lives. Just before we get back to the story, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? And if you're enjoying this journey so far, make sure you're subscribed for more stories like this. The sight of the woman stepping out of the black van sent a jolt through my system that was more paralyzing than the freezing rain had been just hours before. I peered through the narrow slats of the metal grate with my breath caught in my chest, as the woman moved with a regal composure that matched the portrait I had memorized over 2 decades of mourning. Her hair was silvered at the temples, but her eyes held the same fierce intelligence that I saw every morning when I looked in the mirror during my rise to the top of the tech world. Arthur Vance froze in his tracks, and the smirk that had been plastered on his face vanished, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer terror that made his expensive suit look like a shroud. He backed away a step, and his hand went instinctively to his waistband, but the woman didn't flinch as she walked right into the circle of armed guards who seemed suddenly unsure of their orders. She spoke with a voice that was low and resonant, carrying through the ventilation shaft like a bell tolling for a funeral, and she called him by a name I had never heard before. She told him that the game he had been playing for 20 years was finally reaching its end game, and that he had underestimated the one thing he could never buy, which was the loyalty of a mother. I watched as Alara's brother was pulled from the back of the van by a woman who looked like a high-ranking security officer, but she was wearing the same yellow insignia that Alara had on her raincoat. It became clear to me in that moment that I wasn't the only one who had been living a double life, and that the underground network I had just discovered was far more extensive than a few hidden tunnels. Alara squeezed my shoulder from behind, and her grip was a silent command to stay focused on the mission, while the drama unfolded on the garage floor below us. She whispered that the woman wasn't just my mother, but the true founder of the technology that had made the Thorne Empire a global powerhouse before Arthur stole the patents. My mind reeled as I realized that my entire career had been built on a foundation of theft, and that the man I called my mentor was a common thief who had tried to erase the original architect. The guards began to raise their weapons as Arthur regained his composure, and he started screaming that this woman was an imposter who was trying to sabotage the corporate merger. He ordered his men to open fire, but before a single trigger could be pulled, the lights in the garage flickered, and then died completely, plunging the entire level into a void of absolute darkness. I felt Alara move past me with the speed of a shadow as she kicked the grate open and dropped 20 feet onto the roof of a parked SUV with a sound like a muted drumbeat. I followed her lead and felt the jarring impact in my ankles as I landed beside her, while the sounds of shouting and scuffling filled the air around us in the pitch blackness. I pulled the small tactical flashlight from my belt and clicked it on to see Alara engaging 2 of the guards with a martial arts discipline that was as beautiful as it was lethal. I saw the woman who looked like my mother being ushered toward the freight elevator by her own security team, while Arthur was scrambling toward the exit like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. I knew I couldn't let him escape, because if he reached the executive floor, he could trigger a data wipe that would destroy every piece of evidence we had gathered. I leaped from the SUV and tackled Arthur just as he reached the heavy steel doors that led to the stairwell, and we both crashed into the concrete with a force that knocked the wind out of my lungs. He rolled over and looked at me with a wild desperation in his eyes, but as my hood fell back, he finally saw the face of the man he had tried to kill. He gasped my name with a mixture of hatred and awe, because he realized that the beggar he had ignored on the street was the same billionaire who was now pinning him to the ground. Just as I prepared to demand the truth about the night, my mother vanished. A hidden wall panel behind us slid open, and a group of men in tactical gear emerged carrying a banner I had never seen before. They didn't point their weapons at Arthur, but they turned them toward me, and I realized with a sinking heart that the betrayal went even deeper than I could have imagined. The weight of the tactical gear and the cold efficiency of the men surrounding me sent a chill through my spine that was far more bone-deep than the winter rain had ever been. I looked at the barrels of the rifles leveled at my chest, and then back at Arthur, who was slowly rising from the concrete with a jagged laugh that sounded like broken glass. He brushed the dust from his expensive sleeves and looked at me with a pity that was more insulting than his previous hatred, because he knew something I didn't. He leaned in close until I could smell the metallic tang of the garage air on his breath, and he whispered that I was never the king of this castle, but merely a highly paid caretaker. The men in the tactical gear weren't part of my corporate security or even his private mercenaries, but they were part of a global oversight committee I had only heard mentioned in hushed whispers. They were the ones who really owned the patents and the algorithms that powered the modern world, and I was just the charismatic face they used to sell it to the masses. Alara had disappeared into the shadows during the scuffle, and for a moment I felt a crushing sense of loneliness, as if the girl in the yellow raincoat had been a figment of my imagination. My mother stood only 20 feet away, protected by her own circle of guardians, but she didn't move toward me or call out my name, which made the ache in my chest feel like a physical wound. She looked at the men in tactical gear with a neutral expression that suggested she had been negotiating with them for years, while I was busy playing CEO in my glass office. Arthur reached out and snatched the velvet box from my hand with a quickness that I couldn't counter in my pin position, and he held the diamond ring up to the flickering emergency lights. He told the men that the key was back in the right hands, and that the protocol for the total data transition could finally begin without any more delays. I realized then that my undercover mission had played right into their hands because, by leaving my office and stripping off my identity, I had technically vacated my position of power. According to the fine print of the Thorne family charter, which I had never fully read the moment the CEO went missing or became incapacitated, the oversight committee took full control. I had walked into their trap with my eyes wide open, thinking I was being clever by playing the beggar when I was actually giving them the legal grounds to erase me. The lead operative stepped forward and pulled a heavy pair of zip ties from his belt, but before he could secure my wrists, a high-pitched whistle echoed through the garage. It was a sound that didn't belong in a high-tech fortress, but sounded more like a bird call from a deep forest, and it seemed to vibrate the very air around us. Suddenly, the overhead sprinkler system erupted not with water, but with a thick white fog that smelled of peppermint and ozone, which blinded everyone in a matter of seconds. I felt a small, firm hand grab the collar of my jacket and pull me backward with a strength that was surprising for someone of Alara's stature. She hissed in my ear to keep my head down and to follow the sound of her breathing as she navigated the chaos of shouting men and clattering equipment. We moved like ghosts through the white mist, while the sounds of coughing and confused orders filled the garage, and I felt the air pressure change as we entered a small service lift. As the doors slid shut and the lift began to ascend, I saw a glimpse of my mother's face through the closing gap, and she gave me a single nearly invisible nod of approval. It was the first sign of recognition I had received, and it fueled a fire in my gut that burned away the last remnants of my doubt. Alara punched a sequence into the lift controls that bypassed the executive security layers, and she told me that we had 3 minutes before they hardwired the system to stop us. We weren't going to the lobby or the garage, but we were going to the very top floor where the master server was housed in a vacuum-sealed chamber. She told me that the ring Arthur had taken was a decoy I had unknowingly carrying, and that the real key was something I had been wearing my entire life without knowing it. She reached out and touched the small silver watch on my wrist, which had been a gift from my father on my 10th birthday, just days before he disappeared. She twisted the crown of the watch in a specific pattern, and the back of the casing popped open to reveal a microchip that was glowing with a faint blue light. My father hadn't hidden the truth in a vault or a ring, but he had hidden it on my person, knowing I would never take off the only thing I had left of him. The elevator surged upward with a silent velocity that pressed me against the back wall, while the blue glow from my father's microchip illuminated Ilara's face in the cramped space. I stared at the tiny piece of technology humming in my palm, and I felt a wave of shame wash over me because I had spent my entire adult life staring at spreadsheets while the truth was literally strapped to my wrist. Ilara didn't say a word as she pulled a portable interface cable from her tactical vest and connected it to the chip with a precision that made me realize she wasn't just a guardian but a high-level engineer. She explained that this chip contained the original source code for the global communication network, which was the only thing standing between the oversight committee and total digital dominance. Arthur and his shadows didn't just want my money or my buildings, because they wanted the power to rewrite history itself by controlling every byte of data on the planet. The elevator bell chimed with a soft melodic tone as we reached the 99th floor, and the doors slid open to reveal a panoramic view of the city still drowning in the relentless storm. The executive level was eerily quiet, and the floor-to-ceiling glass windows made the lightning flashes look like they were inside the room with us. We stepped out onto the plush white carpet and headed toward the heavy titanium doors of the master server room, where the air was kept at a constant 50 degrees to protect the hardware. I could see my own reflection in the polished surfaces, and I looked like a stranger with my matted hair and dirt-streaked face, but my eyes were more alive than they had been in years. Ilara swiped the chip against the biometric scanner, and the massive doors hissed open to reveal a cathedral of blinking lights and humming cooling towers that processed billions of transactions every second. This was the heart of the Thorne Empire, and I felt a strange sense of homecoming as I walked toward the central console that sat like an altar in the middle of the room. Just as I reached out to insert the chip into the master drive, the lights in the server room turned a deep blood red, and a siren began to wail with a deafening intensity. A voice boomed over the speakers announcing that a security breach had been detected and that a remote wipe of the entire system had been initiated by an external user. I looked at the monitors and saw a progress bar rapidly filling up with the words, "Data deletion in progress," flashing in bright yellow letters. Arthur was trying to burn the house down while he was still inside it just to make sure I didn't get to keep a single scrap of my father's legacy. Ilara's fingers flew across the keyboard as she tried to build a digital firewall to slow down the wipe, but she shouted that we only had 90 seconds before everything was gone forever. I felt a surge of panic, but then I remembered the whisper she had shared with me in the rain about looking at the world from the gutter. I realized that the only way to stop a top-down deletion was to hit the system from the bottom up using the hidden protocols my father had built into the architecture. I pushed Ilara aside gently and began typing a sequence of commands that I had memorized as a child when my father taught me how to play chess on his old computer. It wasn't a corporate password or a high-level encryption key, but it was the name of the street where my mother had first met him in the rain all those years ago. The progress bar stuttered and then froze at 99%, while the red lights stopped flashing and the room returned to its calm blue glow. I heard the sound of the elevator doors opening behind us, and I turned around to see Arthur standing there with a disheveled appearance and a pistol gripped in his trembling hand. He looked like a man who had lost his soul and his mind at the same time as he pointed the weapon directly at my head while he screamed that I was supposed to be a ghost. He wasn't interested in the money anymore, because he just wanted the satisfaction of seeing the last of the Thorne bloodline extinguished before the authorities arrived. Just as he pulled the hammer back on the gun, the glass window behind him shattered into 1,000,000 diamonds, and a figure swung into the room on a high-tension cable. It was the woman from the garage, and she landed with a silent grace that sent a wave of relief through my entire body as she stood between me and the man who had tried to destroy us. The sound of the shattering glass was like 1,000 crystal bells exploding at once as the woman I now knew to be my mother stood between me and the barrel of Arthur's gun. The wind from the 99th floor whipped through the broken window, sending freezing rain and shards of glass dancing across the expensive white carpet like lethal confetti. Arthur stumbled back with his eyes wide, and his breath coming in ragged gasps because he was looking at a woman he had declared dead to the world 20 years ago. My mother didn't say a word, but she held her ground with a stillness that was more terrifying than any shout or threat could ever be in that high-altitude sanctuary. She reached out a hand toward me without breaking eye contact with Arthur, and I felt a surge of strength as I stepped forward to stand beside her in the center of the storm. Alara was still typing furiously at the console behind us as she worked to lock down the servers and broadcast the truth to every news agency on the planet before the Oversight Committee could cut the power. Arthur's hand was shaking so violently that the pistol wavered between my chest and my mother's heart, while he babbled about how he had done everything for the sake of the company. He claimed that my father was too soft and too idealistic to lead a global empire, and that he had only stepped in to ensure the Thorne name survived the cutthroat world of international tech. I looked at the man who had been my mentor for a decade, and I saw nothing but a hollow shell of a human being who had traded his conscience for a seat at a mahogany table. My mother finally spoke, and her voice was as cold and sharp as the wind blowing through the broken window as she told him that he had never been more than a shadow in her husband's light. She revealed that the night she disappeared wasn't an accident but a calculated move to build the underground resistance that would eventually bring him down from the inside. She had been the one guiding Alara and the others through the hidden tunnels of the city, while I was being groomed by Arthur to be his unsuspecting puppet. The realization that my entire life had been a battlefield for two opposing forces made me feel a strange sense of clarity, because the mask of the billionaire had finally cracked for good. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the microchip that was still humming with the blue light of my father's legacy, and I held it up for Arthur to see. I told him that the power he craved was never in the stocks or the buildings, but it was in the truth that he had tried so hard to bury in the mud of the streets. Arthur let out a guttural scream and lunged forward with the gun, but before he could squeeze the trigger, the heavy titanium doors behind him burst open with a deafening roar. A squad of city police officers and federal agents flooded the room with their tactical lights, blinding everyone as they shouted for Arthur to drop the weapon and get on the ground. It turned out that Alara hadn't just been hacking the servers, but she had been live streaming our entire conversation to the Central Precinct and the Attorney General's office. The men in the gray suits were already being rounded up in the lobby below, and the Oversight Committee was frantically trying to distance themselves from the man they had once considered an ally. Arthur dropped the gun and fell to his knees as the weight of his crimes finally crashed down on him, while the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, with a finality that echoed through the server room. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I turned to see my mother looking at me with a mixture of pride and sorrow that broke my heart and healed it all at once. She told me that the CEO of Thorne Industries was dead, but that Marcus Thorne was finally ready to live a life that wasn't built on a foundation of lies. As the authorities led Arthur away, I looked out the broken window at the city below and saw the first rays of the morning sun breaking through the clouds over the harbor. The storm was finally over, but I knew that the real work was just beginning, because I had an empire to dismantle and a family to rebuild. Just as I turned to leave the room with my mother, Alara called out from the console and pointed to a hidden file that had just decrypted itself in the wake of the system reset. It was a video message from my father dated the night of his disappearance, and it was addressed specifically to the man I had become during my hours in the rain. The air in the server room felt still and sacred as my father's face flickered onto the massive wall-mounted monitors with a graininess that spoke of a different era. He looked younger than I remembered, with the same tired but kind eyes that had always made me feel safe when I was a boy in the back of his workshop. He spoke directly into the camera with a steady voice that seemed to bridge the gap between the past and the present moment in a way that made the room feel warm despite the broken window. He told me that if I was watching this, it meant the system had been tested, and that I had likely faced the same darkness that had tried to consume him. He explained that he never wanted me to be a billionaire or a titan of industry, but he wanted me to be a man who understood that true power was the ability to see the invisible people. He had programmed the system to only unlock the final truth when the CEO was willing to step into the shoes of the forgotten and the downtrodden. My mother stood beside me with a hand on my arm, and I could see the tears shining in her eyes as she heard her husband's voice for the first time in 20 years. My father revealed that the wealth of the Thorne Empire wasn't meant to stay in a vault, but was designed to be redistributed through a secret protocol called the Rainfall Initiative. This was a system that would automatically fund housing, education, and healthcare for every person who had been pushed to the margins of the city we had built. I realized then that my undercover experiment wasn't just a whim of my own curiosity, but was a subconscious response to the seeds my father had planted in my mind so long ago. I turned to Alara and told her to execute the protocol immediately, and I watched as the servers began to hum with a new and purposeful energy. Millions of dollars began to flow out of the stagnant corporate accounts and into the hands of community leaders and local charities that had been struggling for decades. The screens displayed a map of the city as it began to glow with thousands of points of light, representing the lives that were being changed in real time by a single click of a button. I looked down at my tattered jacket and the dirt-stained boots that had carried me through the storm, and I felt more dignified in them than I ever had in a $3,000 suit. I walked over to the broken window and looked out at the sunrise, which was now painting the skyscrapers in shades of gold and violet as the city woke up to a new reality. The police had cleared the floor, and the silence was only broken by the distant sound of sirens and the waking hum of the streets below. I knew that my name would be in every headline by noon, and that the board of directors would be scrambling to save what was left of their reputations. I didn't care about the stock price or the quarterly earnings anymore, because I had found the mother I thought was lost, and a purpose I never knew I needed. My mother walked up to me and handed me the yellow raincoat that Alara had been wearing earlier, and she told me that the world didn't need a billionaire CEO, but it needed a leader who wasn't afraid to get wet. I took the coat and draped it over my arm as we walked toward the elevator together, leaving the glass towers and the digital ghosts behind us for good. We stepped out of the lobby and onto the sidewalk where the air was fresh, and the puddles were reflecting a sky that was finally clear of the heavy clouds. I saw a man huddled in a doorway across the street, looking just as lost as I had felt only 10 hours ago, and I walked straight toward him without a second thought. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a warm cup of coffee I had grabbed from the lobby break room, and I knelt in the damp morning air to hand it to him. As our eyes met, I saw the spark of a new beginning, and I knew that the undercover billionaire was gone, forever replaced by a man who finally understood the value of a single human connection. The story of Marcus Thorne wasn't ending here, but it was finally beginning on the very pavement where it had almost been extinguished. That brings us to the end of this story. I'd love to know where you were watching from today, and if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe for more.